This video is for Chapter 6 of Ellen Lamont's The Mating Game. This chapter is entitled The More Things Change. So she begins this chapter by initially kind of reminding us what her focus is, that it is her belief that courtship behaviors matter in their own right because they reflect beliefs about appropriate interactions between genders. So in this way, she is kind of pushing back against the idea or the attitude that these courtship behaviors are meaningless, that they reflect personal preferences as regards to having some larger social significance. And if you recall from the previous 3 chapters, while both heterosexual men and women, as well as the LGBTQ respondents of her sample, all profess to want egalitarian love, right? This love where your partner is your equal and you share equally in paid labor, household labor, and care work. That for the most part, everyone in her sample says that this is the type of love that they're looking for, regardless of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. When we actually, explored the dating practices, what she found is that the heterosexual couples tended to engage in courtship rituals that highlighted perceived gender differences. And if you recall, some of those rituals were things like, the man being the first, making the first call, asking the woman out on a first date, paying for that date, as well as most of the subsequent others. The man initiating the talk about, the exclusivity of the relationship, the man proposing. In terms of sex, the kind of acceptance of some level of sexual double standard, and it's not just that the bulk of the heterosexual sample participated and supported those rituals and dating norms. It's that, in addition to that, they oftentimes would use gender essentialism to explain them or to justify them. They would say things like, oh, well, it's in a man's nature to want to chase and be the aggressor. It's in a woman's nature to develop feelings and not just want a sexual relationship. And so, she noted in those chapters when she was discussing that dating behavior, the concerns that she had that, that those types of attitudes would exist in a population where both the men and women largely proclaimed to be, progressive and empowered, and a lot of them even using the term feminist to describe themselves. In comparison, the LGBTQ couples, when she was talking about their dating behavior, oftentimes they endorsed greater equality and flexibility in their dating practices. And that was, in regards to everything from, who is responsible for asking a person out on the date, to who is responsible, for paying for the date, who initiates. Is there a talk about commitment? And if so, who initiates it? Oftentimes they weren't following, they just weren't unconsciously, following these traditional gender scripts. So oftentimes they were making decisions that were much more deliberative and much more individuated, and focused on the person that they were in a relationship with. And of course, perhaps unsurprisingly, they were less likely to use gender essentialist explanations to explain their behavior. Instead, they indicated they had a much more fluid understanding of the concept of gender. So in this chapter, she kind of builds upon that research by asking the question, how does this matter long term? Does it translate to greater gender inequality, the fact that they practice these gendered or did not practice these gender dating behaviors? Or are these gender dating behaviors just meaningless rituals that are perpetuated by personal preference, meaning, that they don't have kind of a larger social significance or social underpinnings. So in this chapter, she examines the relationship between the narratives employed during courtship and then those drawn upon to justify division of labor and care work in long-term committed relationships. And in answer to her previous question, about whether or not this gendered dating seems to matter long term, the short answer is that yes, her research suggests that it does, that how people date may set the stage for the dynamics of their long-term relationships. So let's tackle, how that becomes the case. And, we'll do that in the same order that she did in the chapter. First, by discussing the responses of heterosexual women, then by discussing the responses of heterosexual men, and then by considering the responses of her LGBTQ respondents. So, similar to dating, there are gendered expectations of heterosexual men and women in committed relationships, and they come from the media, they come from what we see in our own families, they come from the messages that we get from, our peers, institutions like maybe our church. But we have some sense, we've been given some scripts about how heterosexual men and women, how they should act in a committed relationship, what they should do for one another. And so what is very common, what is a traditional script for heterosexual relationships is that women are expected to perform what the book labels labors of love. So they're supposed to engage in this household and caretaking behavior that's meant to sustain the relationship. And so this could be, everything from, cooking for your partner to cleaning up to kind of taking control about, planning, celebrations or acknowledging, anniversaries. But all of that is kind of seen as being the types of duties that belong to women in heterosexual relationships. So they're designated as being feminine. And so the book states that these practices disadvantage women and privilege men because oftentimes they add a great deal of responsibility, to women's kind of day-to-day lives, and increases kind of their burden, their work burden, but then at the same time, it makes these men's lives easier. If you think about comparing it to their single life versus they're now, in a committed heterosexual partnership life, for a lot of women, they are now doing more work than what they would have done when they necessarily were just single and looking after themselves. And it's the opposite for a lot of men, that they are now doing less work than, in terms of household labor and care work than what they would have done if they were still, living and operating as a single individual. And so the question she's interested in, is how do these self-identified, empowered feminist heterosexual women, how do they justify those practices, right? How are they okay with it? And so to begin this discussion, she introduces the concept of the upstairs downstairs myth, a concept that pops up originally in the writing of Arlie Hochschild, who is also the sociologist that we can kind of thank for the concept of the second shift itself, the idea that women work a first shift, at their job, their paid labor job outside of the home, and then they come home and then they work a second shift where they do this unpaid household labor and care work. And so the upstairs downstairs myth is the idea that women take care of everything that's upstairs, and men take care of everything that is downstairs, i.e. the basement, or, I guess maybe the garage. Sometimes you can hear this also kind of discussed as being inside outside work, that in the household, women take care of the labor that occurs inside, laundry and cleaning and cooking, and men take care of the labor that occurs largely outside, cutting the grass, fixing up, the exterior of the home, washing the cars. And of course, part of why this is significant is the idea is it well not the idea is the fact that there is a significant time difference in the amount of time it takes to do intermittent outside chores, the occasional fix up, the perhaps once a week lawn cutting during the right time of year, the once a week, maybe at most, washing of the cars, once again, the right time of the year, versus the fact that a lot of the inside chores are daily and ongoing, right? Think about the number of times that if you have a family, that you're cooking for your family, that you're washing dishes, that you're doing, laundry, that you are, wiping countertops and sweeping and mopping and vacuuming floors. And so, it is a myth that, this is at all equal. But yet it's also a myth that has sustained itself over time, that people will often, or people in heterosexual partnerships in particular, will often discuss how they divvy up household labor in this upstairs, downstairs, inside, outside divide, and they'll present it like it is largely equitable. But if you really look at it, just to, logically in terms of the amount of time that it requires, it is not. And so, when she would talk to her female heterosexual respondents, they would explain their division of household labor. And the justifications that they would offer were usually related to the most popular one being personal preferences, right? The idea that the woman just happens to prefer to cook. She enjoys cooking, while, the man likes to do outside stuff, likes fixing things. And what Lamont notes is interesting is that, they offer this personal preference explanation as if preferences aren't likely related to the gender norms and gender socialization that we receive, at young ages, right? As if, that inside-outside divide wasn't what we saw in our own families, or what wasn't drilled in our heads, the idea that to be a good woman is meant to, be a good cook or to take pride in your home, while, men are expected to get their, hands dirty, and, it's not necessarily considered, manly to spend your time, in the kitchen necessarily. So, the fact that they act like these adult preferences just come out of nowhere, as opposed to being directly related to gender norms and gender socialization, Lamont felt, that was kind of odd and worth noting. But when she would present it as a gendered, as opposed to personal preference, women would indicate less support for the division, and they did not like it when it was presented as, you're a woman and you're doing women's work, and your male partner isn't helping you with that work because it's considered to be women's work, right? When she added kind of that kind of gendered explanation to it, the women in her sample would become uncomfortable, and resistant, to that division of labor that they largely just found acceptable, more or less, when it was being presented by themselves as being just a matter of personal preferences. Another justification that the heterosexual women offered was the belief that women care more. They care more about cleanliness. They care more about what their home looks like. They care more, about not establishing, bad, household, labor habits. And then that belief was oftentimes partnered with the belief that men couldn't be trusted to do this household labor due to their inattentiveness. So what that really just kind of becomes summed up as is, is the idea that if you have these standards of cleanliness, these high standards of cleanliness, and they're your standards of cleanliness, then it should be your job to make sure that your household meets those standards. And once again, she points out that same issue. No one's really questioning, where did these standards come from? If women really do care more about, their home being clean, what fostered that disparity in care? And if men are less attentive about that, once again, where have they received kind of this messaging, that that's acceptable or okay? And she noted that, the ideas about handling childcare were even more gendered, with the expectation that women, expected that they were going to be doing a lot more of the work in regards to childcare. But she did also note that their thoughts about childcare were a lot less concrete than their thoughts about household labor. And that's just because for her sample, a lot of them do not have children as of yet. So they are kind of speaking of something that hasn't happened, that they don't necessarily have a concrete plan for when it does happen. And let's be honest, there's that quote about best laid plans. So even if they had an idea of how they thought it would go when they had children, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it would actually go. But, even just, with those kind of vague kind of general understandings of, how they think they will be splitting up childcare duties with their partner. The fact of the matter is even though a lot of the women were not necessarily gung-ho about the idea of giving up their career, a lot of them reluctantly seem to accept that if someone has to give up their career, that it will be them. And, she noted that even the ones that, were reluctant about the idea of giving up their career, they also, though, were not very supportive of the idea of their male partner being a stay-at-home father. Which of course is interesting and really probably just relates back to, not just how we internalize, the gendered expectations for our own gender, but how we internalize the gender expectations for the opposite gender as well, and how we evaluate them, even when we may not be purposefully trying to, we evaluate them using that, internalized, hegemonic masculine ideal. So what this often means in terms of, how they perceive men, or how they perceive the assistance or lack of assistance that men offer them in regards to household labor, is for most of her respondents, they didn't see this as a lack of care, right? The fact that they were doing the bulk of the household labor or caregiving wasn't taken as an indication that their male partner didn't care. And instead, they would argue that they shared their care in other ways. But what's interesting is when she would ask them for kind of feedback about how they then how they then show that they care. I'm getting all tongue-tied here. They would point to things like their intermittent care work was seen as symbolic. They would give it symbolic meaning, right? So, when a man would participate in the household labor, when he would, help take care of the kids or plan or cook dinner or, do some chore without asking, instead of that just seeing as him doing his equitable share, this was kind of given greater symbolism and evidence of, he cares about me because he sometimes helps me with this. The other type of evidence that was given as examples of caring, and the idea that caring can be done differently, with things like, tokens of appreciation and dates, and things like telling her she's beautiful, for example. And of course, whether or not you think this is equitable or not, subjectively, of course, is going to, vary person by person. But if you take a step back at it and just try to think about it objectively, like if you were measuring it in terms of time spent, if women by and large show the way that they care, if heterosexual women show that they care for their partners by doing the bulk of the cooking and cleaning and making sure that those needs are met. And they're saying that how their male partner shows them they care is by taking them on an occasional date or telling them they're beautiful or sometimes helping out around the home. Just subjectively, what this leads to, of course, is differing levels of like time investment. And and the thing about it, different levels of time investment is, of course, this can become burdensome over time. And it's worth noting that most of the research that looks at time usage among husbands and wives, and how they divvy up household labor. Most of the research just does conclusively show that women spend more time on these household activities than men do. And that's kind of what the chart there from 2015 is showing. And so I think, as one respondent kind of correctly notes, the distinction between being maternal versus being wifely is very blurry. And I think that's why this section of the chapter is called Mommying Their Men, right? That for like heterosexual women, the traditional script about how you take care of your man is very maternal. It's very, making sure he's fed and making sure his house is clean and making sure he has, everything that he needs, which is really, when you think about it, the same things that we expect of good mothers in terms of taking care of their babies. So, in terms of how the women themselves interpret this, though, is interesting, because for a lot of them, instead of feeling like they were used or the subordinate party, instead they oftentimes said that they felt they were more dominant in the relationship because they did the majority of the relationship work. But when Lamont, picked and probed at that a little, what she discovered is that the narratives often illustrated the assumption that men won't or don't accommodate women's interests, while women are expected to be more adaptable in order to keep the peace and to keep the relationship going. And so, as opposed to making demands that their partner change or that the, household division of labor is more equitable, instead, a lot of these women just kind of willingly adapted to the situation in their home. And then, with a little bit of, psychology, they then convince themselves, after adapting, to that inequitable division of labor in their home, they then convince themselves that this actually was a position of power, that they had more power because they were the person that was doing all the grocery shopping and all the cooking and all the cleaning. And as they are offering these narratives, once again, they are refraining from viewing this using a larger gendered lens. Instead, even if they were complaining about their partner, they were more apt to blame their partner's individual personalities, as opposed to saying, this is an example of the gender stratification you see in larger society, or this is an example of how, even when you are a woman that is working a full-time job a lot, along with your partner, this is the holdover from the separate spheres, is the expectation that that even though you both now work in the work sphere, that the home sphere is still predominantly your sphere that you're responsible responsible for. So, as opposed to offering this kind of like more sociological explanation, instead they would offer this much more narrow individual personal one, where they would just say, oh, my husband just, or my boyfriend refuses to change, or he's just not interested in learning how to become a good cook, or he spent his whole life as a messy bachelor, and he just is too rooted in his ways. But what is interesting is that sometimes when they were blaming their partner's individual personalities, they would then use conventional notions of gender difference to explain those personalities, right? They would say things like, well, like most men, he just doesn't really care much about being clean. Or he'd be like, oh, he really can't cook, and he just thinks that this isn't cooking is something that women are just naturally better at. So it was interesting to what extent they would call upon gendered norms and stereotypes to a certain extent, but how they were largely very hesitant to kind of use this gendered lens to identify the gender inequality that exists in their own relationships. And maybe kind of a few notable exceptions were the ones who drew a connection between the fact that the dominance that existed in the dating rituals, that it can carry over in the committed relationships, and then it can become problematic, right? And so she did have a couple of women that noted, the fact that they, in dating rituals, the fact that they let their male partner take the lead and make the bulk of the decisions, and they went along with it. But now they're in a relationship and they're finding that they're having trouble asserting themselves or getting their male partner to address troubling behavior or to compromise. And it's largely because there was not kind of this history of listening to one another and compromising during those early days of dating, where the traditional kind of dating script said that men had more power in regards to decision making during that time period. So what about the men? What did they see about this? Well, similar to the heterosexual women, the heterosexual men chalked a lot of the inequality in their relationships up to personal preferences and skills. And by embracing kind of this belief in, differing gender expertise and skill sets, and promoting this separate but equal philosophy, what it allowed them to build inequality into their relationships. So when they were in relationships and they had these kind of this sense that, okay, well, as a woman, she just cares a lot more about cleaning, and she's, always been a better cook, or, she's, babysat and has all this experience with babies. So that's why she does the bulk of this type of labor. But as the man, I'm good at making these leadership decisions, or I'm good with finances. Once again, by imagining that there is this gendered expertise, it builds in this inequality where now the burden of this relational maintenance and upkeep, it falls more so on heterosexual women's shoulders. But that separate but equal philosophy means that the heterosexual men are not necessarily feeling guilty or even aware of that inequality. And so, there's a whole section about the belief in gender expertise. And Lamont notes that a lot of the men, they allowed women greater authority in areas perceived as feminine, which, keep in mind, because of the doctrine of separate spheres, that is a lot of the household, maybe with the exception of, household finances, and, maybe with the exception of like, house maintenance, upkeep, in terms of like, structural types of mechanical types of things. And it's not just that they, perceived women to have greater expertise in those areas, but the fact that they oftentimes explained it in gender essentialist terms, right? As, women are just better at this. This is what women do. She's a woman and that she and they like this. They like being clean. She likes to cook. Um, and what Lamont notes is surprisingly, even men who claimed a feminist identity offered these types of explanations. The other type of justification for this unequal division of labor in their households that these men would kind of voice, along with using these gendered understandings of preferences and skills, is that largely the men just kind of voiced resistance to equal division of household labor, and they oftentimes would present this in a gendered way, in the sense of, I'm a man and I just don't like that type of work, or I just don't know how to do this. And similar to what she saw in the courtship narratives, is that one concession justified the lack of another. So if they did compromise or, concede on anything, like, okay, well, I agree, that I'll cook dinner at least one night out of the week, then oftentimes they would call upon that concession as a justification for the lack of not doing something else. So if I'm helping with the cooking, then, it's unfair to expect me to also, be responsible for, doing the laundry, right? So all of this just kind of illustrates that in general, there was just this resistance to equality. And she says that they relied more upon the notions of what they considered to be fair as opposed to what they considered to be equal. And that this was especially true if there was an income differential, that if they felt like they had the type of job that made more money or required more longer hours or a greater time investment, then they did not feel as if it was fair for their female partner to expect them to equally contribute to the household labor. But Lamont noted that when the shoe was on the other foot, they would still complain. So if they happened to be in a partnership where the woman made more money or had a job that required greater time investment and therefore did not necessarily do as much of the household labor as the male partner wanted her to do, then that fairness explanation would kind of fall apart, right? So it kind of just shows that, that fairness explanation kind of only was upheld when it was meant to privilege them and kind of justify their own lack of full participation in household labor. When discussing the role of caregiving and childcare, similar to women, once again, most of them are not parents. But for those who were parents, they were divorced or on the brink of divorce. And a lot of that was due to strain around division of labor and finances, just suggesting that this situation where you have women doing the bulk of the household labor and care work it's tenuous even before you add children. But once you add children, it can become especially stressful and strained because the amount of work increases. And so, even if they were willing to pretend, or maybe they even truly felt like it was equitable before, even though of course it really wasn't, once you add the child into the mix, then the inequities become much more glaring and apparent. And this is especially so for these couples because, these men, they largely aren't desiring a long-term stay-at-home partner. That was discussed earlier in the book, that they do not want those old traditional breadwinner gender norms foisted upon them. So they want a partner that works part, if not full time. And most of them also don't want to be a long-term stay-at-home parent themselves. So just think for a moment what this means, right? If you largely aren't supportive of the idea that your female partner is going to be a stay-at-home mother once you have children, and you yourself as a heterosexual male, you are not interested in being a stay-at-home father, then it raises those issues that Hochschild identified. Then that means that you're going to have multiple shifts, a first shift of paid labor and a second and third shift of, household labor and care work. And in an egalitarian relationship, those second and third shifts should be shared equally between the male and female partners. But what we're seeing here is even before the introduction of children, that second and third shift isn't being shared equitably. So when you add a child to it and those inequities become even more glaring, maybe it's not that surprising that that this becomes the type of stressor that can contribute to divorce. Now, what's interesting is their answer to this, as well as their answer to getting around the equal division of household labor, is, especially if they have the resources, they are big on just outsourcing the labor, hiring someone to come and clean the home, hiring someone, paying for daycare or, a nanny for the children, hiring someone to do meal prep or, buying prepped meals. So for men who have the resources, they would much rather spend those resources outsourcing the labor as opposed to taking up that labor themselves. So how do they show they care? Well, they show they care through the intermittent gestures that are conventionally gendered, similar to the gestures they did back when they were just courting. So examples of this that the book gives are things like buying gifts and flowers, whining and dining. And she points out that these acts are based on cultural stereotypes of what women like, meaning that, yes, some women may like those gestures, a whole lot. And for some women, those gestures really don't mean as much as men think that they do. But more importantly, according to Lamont, is that these romantic excursions took the place of any larger sacrifices that might have otherwise made, such as sharing housework, respecting partners' needs on a daily basis. So even a woman who, loves flowers, maybe what she really would love, especially, if her male partner started doing it consistently, is tackling the daily chores together, doing dishes together, taking turns cooking dinner every night. That might be a much more helpful and instrumental display of love. But that is not the display of love that the men in her sample largely called upon. And most of them did not note how, by largely, having the roses as romance approach, how this contributes to that gender imbalance in terms of care and time burden. Right? If women are supposed to show they care by cooking and cleaning and those types of acts that happen daily and require a daily time investment, but men show they care by telling her she's beautiful and taking her out, maybe once a week at most, buying flowers once, twice a month at most. Once again, that is just a very differing level of time investment. And it's the type of thing that certainly long term is going to result in real inequities in terms of stress. So turning to the LGBTQ sample now. So, they're in relationships, long-term relationships, just like the heterosexual couples. So caring activities are crucial to the maintenance of all romantic relationships. Because as the book notes, people do love both through everyday acts as well as symbolic gestures. And so the question becomes, what do the LGBTQ respondents do to communicate romance, love, and care to their partners? Given that what Lamont saw in the heterosexual relationships, those acts and those gestures were so very gendered. So, what does this then look like in couples where those traditional gender norms are not being followed, not being practiced? So what she found is that in a lot of the LGBTQ partnerships, they reimagined normative practices as egalitarian, and the focus, kind of like in kind of like what it was in the dating rituals as well, is on mutual gestures and treating partners as individuals with specific needs, right? So the mutuality of looking out for each other, and instead of just embracing these kind of traditional scripts about what men are looking for and what women are looking for, by paying close attention to your individual partner and being more responsive to their specific needs and wants. Interestingly, household labor wasn't conceptualized as caregiving, but rather as home maintenance. And since both partners live in the home, they were both expected to participate. And only a few of the LGBTQ respondents wanted a traditional division of labor. And instead, most of them, they treated that division of labor with great suspicion. If they found themselves in relationships where those kind of traditional gendered, caregiving dynamics were being enacted. So instead, it's more like, we both live in this home. It's both of our responsibilities to take care of this home. And so we're going to approach it from kind of this position of, mutual kind of responsibility and expectation. And that those responsibilities and expectations are not attached to gendered expectations about how men and women are supposed to behave, or how the type of work that men and women are supposed to just innately be better at doing. In regards to child rearing, maybe unsurprisingly, given when the data collection for this book took place, none of her LGBTQ respondents had children. So all of them were speaking from this non-concrete, abstract kind of place. And for a lot of them, they did not even have any definite plans related to having children one day. She noted that that's because at this time there were a lot of challenges related to both the structural supports as well as resources of raising children and being part of a LGBTQ couple. So to the extent that they thought about it, it was abstract and future oriented. And as she notes, a lot of it was speculative because no one had children. But to the extent that they did think about it, they, once again, kind of illustrated this model of being deliberate and coming up with ideas that are outside of the kind of traditional scripts. And so one thing that she pointed out is that several of her LGBTQ respondents talked about child rearing using a communal approach. Raising children as part of a community, as opposed to having your own, individual children, your own private families. Other kind of unique themes to this population is that they emphasized how care work can change over the relationship, how someone can be the caregiver, and then, as time goes on, maybe those roles, shift, based on the needs, the individual needs of each partner and what's going on in the lives of each partner during time periods. And so I really like that quote from 169. Instead of reenacting scripts, the focus was on constant communication, evaluation, and renegotiation, right? So just emphasizing, that you need to have this flexibility, that you need to constantly be communicating and talking with your partner about how to take care of one another, how to show you love one another. And so this chapter ends by just offering some concluding thoughts, first about the heterosexual relationships, and then about the relationships in the LGBTQ population. So what Lamont notes is that while heterosexual men and women assert they want egalitarian relationships, their relationship practices reveal they cling to the idea of gendered preferences and skills, without considering the larger role of gender role socialization and expectations regarding gender normativity, or the consequences if you don't uphold, gender norms. So heterosexual women are socialized and expected to show that they care through household labor that then becomes distinguished as care work, while heterosexual men engage in intermittent romantic gestures, largely as they did during courtship, and that this division of labor is further justified by gender essentialist explanations related to differing gender areas of expertise. And this is just exacerbated once children and child rearing enter the picture. All of this just, meaning that despite what they profess about wanting egalitarian love, that in a lot of cases, at least based on her sample data, that doesn't wind up being what they end up with. And it doesn't seem like that their relationships are going to become more egalitarian over time, as the relationship deepens, as they get married, as they add children to their family. LGBTQ respondents' relationship practices demonstrate the potential for greater relationship equality. And that's because, because they consciously choose to reject normative practices, and they create new ways of expressing romance and care to their partners with that focus on mutuality, and the focus on individualization, their focus on flexibility and ongoing communication. It winds up that they do have relationships that exhibit greater equality than the heterosexual relationships. And she notes that this is probably because for many queer relationships, they often cannot rely on well-established practices and ideologies. So they are going off script because the script wasn't created for families and marriages and couples that look like them. But that going off script is a positive here, because by going off script, they're able to negotiate and create something better, something that puts them closer to that egalitarian ideal, as opposed to heterosexual couples who, despite saying they want that egalitarian ideal, they find themselves getting tripped up and kind of falling back on those traditional scripts, scripts that weren't created to achieve egalitarian love. Most of those scripts were created to lead to, what your textbook calls traditional marriage, that breadwinner, house, homemaker model. But, there is a word of caution, about the study's limitation, and this goes beyond the other kind of limitations we've addressed in previous chapters and videos, related to the fact that they are more educated, than the average person, the fact that they're all located in this largely progressive, Bay Area. But then particularly in regards to the LGBTQ relationships that she's focusing on in this chapter, she notes that it was unclear what would happen over time, in particular as partners either had children or just fell into relationship patterns. Just as with heterosexual couples, behaviors may not live up to expectations in the long run. It's easier to rethink expectations at the beginning of the relationship than later on as people fall into routines. And so she just offers that as kind of a note of caution, because of course, as noted, none of the LGBTQ relationships involved children, but then additionally, comparative to the average length of the heterosexual relationships, they also were on average average much shorter. So, perhaps this was just an overly rosy, kind of optimistic discussion about where their relationships were, at that given time. Then that they would run into some of the same issues as their relationship solidified, that she saw in the heterosexual couples. But that doesn't mean that they still didn't have that greater flexibility, particularly when she was just comparing them to, heterosexual couples that had roughly, the same, length of duration. So if you found this, interesting, and you want some additional reading material to shed light on this phenomena, because, noted that this was, this is a pretty small, sample, and it definitely has its limitations in terms of generalizability and representativeness. There has been other data, and I'm not gonna point you to the actual research articles, but if you want to read, about how that data has popped up in easier, more mainstream, reading, I give you 3 articles you can kind of read, that kind of highlight those distinctions between LGBTQ relationships and heterosexual relationships, particularly as it relates to both the division of labor in the household as well as communication differences. And so I have 2 articles actually all 3 from the New York Times. And yeah, so just a little bit of extra reading in case this is something that you're interested in.